Okay. And okay. Let's get started here. Do I cringe whenever someone calls me Dr. Broussard? Not at all. It doesn't bother me. It's like I also don't. It doesn't bother me when they call me Mr. Broussard or Jeff or anything. I don't care. It does not affect my life much one way or the other. Unless they were looking for, a medical doctor, in which case I would really like to get out of there. Okay, so where are we at? So we were talking last time about kind of postman. Oh, yeah, I thought this might come up. Uh, yeah, that it's really really awful. And don't get me wrong, I'm not exactly like I'm not a fan of Charlie Kirk. I'm not a not fan of Charlie Kirk. I don't really care about Charlie Kirk. But political violence is bad. And bad things happen when you start to assassinate your political opponents. Um, so, that's bad. And obviously, terrible for his wife and two kids. It's really, really sad. And it's sad that people feel like they have to resort to violence over politics. That's, not a good development in a country that already has some issues, if you will. And I can't imagine that anything good will come of this at all. So, really terrible. And, I saw it just before I came to class. Second, I mean, no one should ever have to see one of the videos that are out there on Twitter. They're terrible. But the second you see it go through the neck, there's not much anyone could do about it. I've known enough trauma doctors that I was like, oh no, that's not good. But it's really terrible. Political violence is a bad thing, and it does not lead to good, happy places in a democracy when you kill your political opponents, no matter how revolting you might find them. Um, and I don't know. I don't know that much about Charlie Kirk, but you shouldn't shoot your political opponents. It's a bad thing. Okay, on on to other things. I have so many friends who've just been like messaging me like all this information, and we're all political junkies. So this one was like, holy crap. But anyway, that is gonna be that is gonna be bad. Bad things will happen probably from this. Okay, now on a much much happier note, where were we last class? Don't go look at the video, by the way. If you like haven't seen the video, don't go watch the video. it's not good. It's a little, I mean, I know we're all desensitized, but it's a little traumatizing. So, okay, we ended off here, right? On this delightful slide, talking about childhood's journey, which, that's just after talking about someone getting assassinated. Seems like a really weird transition, but I don't know how to make it better than that. So, we're talking about childhood, right? We kind of came here to the end of the industrial or the end of the 19th century, right? We're getting industrialization has really picked up, and we get this separation of upper and middle class children who are treated as children and get a childhood, and those of the lower classes who don't, right? And if this is a major theme in some of the works of Charles Dickens, right? So if you look at like Oliver Twist, this is all about a kid who, comes from the poor, and he needs to scrape by and survive and work as a chimney sweep, right? And all sorts of things like this. And as I said last class, what ends up happening is these folks, in the upper and middle classes, look at their children like, how delightful, my wonderful children who I love. And then they look at the children of the poor and they're like, yeah, but those are children too. And they're not getting a childhood. And so they, through a lot of political action, um, start to try and force down and universalize that vision of childhood onto everybody, right? Now, it's never a project that's complete. Not everybody gets a childhood in the same way, but it's definitely something that they do. And, we could talk about the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century child saving movement, right? I talked about this a little bit last time. Child saving movement that comes from, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elites in places like the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, all of which is aimed at ending things like child labor and getting, young people the basic education that they need. Now, it's not perfect, and obviously there's a lot of missteps and problems, in how it is actually put into work. One of the things that happens is the people who are trying to universalize childhood through institutional means, how to put this kindly, they don't really know what they're doing, right? Because no one's ever tried to do this. And so they create a bunch of institutions to try and do this. Some of them work, some of them don't, and they all start trying to borrow ideas from each other, right? They create things like industrial schools, right? Where you take kids who have been, convicted of crimes, like they call juvenile delinquents, and you put them in an industrial school, right? Where they have to go because they were arrested and sentenced. And there they're supposed to learn factory skills so they can then go on and work in factories and, make a living. So a lot of these things don't go particularly well. And it's a constant process of experimentation through the next, century and a quarter to try and figure out what the right way to sort of universalize the notion of childhood that's come from kind of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant middle and upper classes across the board in these societies. Okay. So some important ideas that Postman kind of wants to pull out when it comes to thinking about childhood. So one of the key ones comes from John Locke, right? The English philosopher and kind of an important figure in the English and Scottish Enlightenments. And one of the things that Locke kind of contributes to our understanding of childhood is this notion of childhood as, where's my highlighter? What he calls a tabula rasa or a blank slate, right? So tabula rasa is just Latin for blank slate. Basically, what Locke suggests, and it remains a really powerful idea that has a lot of currency going forward, is that children are unwritten, right? That there is nothing kind of in their genetics, in their class makeup, in their, the way they were brought into the world that leads them to be a particular way, right? It isn't that like, and he's resisting here a notion that appears in like 19th century eugenics, right? And other kind of philosophical movements that the children of the poor basically are morally deficient because they come from the poor, right? And poor, it must be poor genetics or poor inheritance that leads them that way. And Locke pushes back against this and he says, no. In fact, the mind of a child is a blank slate, right? There's nothing there. There's no pre-programming on it. What happens to that child is ultimately a result of what gets written on that blank slate, right? For good or for ill, right? Good or bad. And so bad kids, right? If a child becomes delinquent, if there's something wrong with that child, it is not the fault of the child. It is in fact, the fault of the people who wrote things on that blank slate. And so teaching children, right, and forming children morally takes on this very, very moral kind of quality, right? Because it's if that mind is blank, if you put bad things on that blank slate, um, you have done something shameful, right? You have done something bad. Now, well, maybe I'll tell you this in a sec. Well, I'll tell you these other 2 points, and then you know I'll add some nuance to this maybe a little bit. So for Locke, right, he's one of the things that he's sort of suggests children need to be trained vigorously, both physically and mentally. So you can blame Locke at least to some extent for something like gym class, right? So if you didn't enjoy gym class in junior high and high school, um, you can sort of blame John Locke a little bit because, his philosophy is influential in the sense that it's like, look, we have to take care of the physical and mental needs of young people, right? The body as a whole. And so it needs to be trained both mentally and physically. And you do this, basically with a kind of carrot and stick model. You shame people when they do badly, you give them credit when they do well, and so you give them good grades when they do well and bad grades when they do poorly as a kind of way of encouraging them, right? At the very kind of edge of things, I suppose, like the gold star, for kindergartners and first graders is kind of the equivalent here. Okay, there is a dark side to this idea as well, right? Um, and if we think of, young people as a blank slate, we ultimately put that, sort of imply, oops, I wrote that wrong. Malleable. They're malleable, right? So whoever has control of their education ultimately has tremendous power to shape them. So, in some senses, right, this philosophy can be misused in major ways, right? Because it suggests the power of education to shape people into the kind of subjects that you want them to be. So, in fascist societies, in Nazi Germany, Italy, and then in kind of communist societies, there's this really strong focus on shaping that blank slate, right? Of getting there very early and writing what's on there. And in some senses, right, something like the residential schools movement in Canada is an expression of this idea as well, right? Because, in a sense, you want to be the one writing whatever you want on that blank slate. So potentially, if you are able to get to children relatively early before they've learned, values, languages, and such that you don't care for, you could inscribe, at least theoretically, your values, your language, your religious thoughts, your philosophy, your way of life onto those people. Right. So it does express itself also in negative ways. It's not simply a noble idea. It has a bit of a dark side also. Okay. So, oh, Rousseau. I always have a hard time with Rousseau. Um, so you're right. This is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, J.J. Rousseau, um, the French Romantic thinker. And unfortunately, I don't mean romantic in the sense of like romance, but actually like the romantic kind of period. Rousseau is really, really influential in terms of the history of pedagogy. And he has this, what I will say, is a somewhat unusual set of ideas. So, you know, most of it is laid out in this book, Emile ou de l'éducation. Um, but you find it in some of his other works as well. And he's, as I said, a romantic. And what this means is he thinks that, civilization is essentially equal to a corruption of the human person, right? That basically human beings in their state of nature, right? And he thinks of this as the best state for human beings, the state where they're most likely to be happy, basically aren't educated, right? They don't have this kind of formal education. They're not forced into institutions. And for the romantics, they would really like human beings to return to the state of nature. And this influences how Rousseau thinks about children and he thinks about education. And to put it in like really, really sort of like sanitized terms, um, is what I kind of have here on the slide. He'll suggest that children are a good in and of themselves. And, I would tend to agree with this. Um, but largely, what he suggests is that when we try to educate children, when we try to put them into formalized education that teaches them the values of a society, we are ultimately doing a sort of violence upon them, right? Because they represent the closest thing humans have to the state of nature, because they are the least kind of civilized, to put it in Rousseau's terms. So they have this kind of unbounded energy, this connection to themselves, right? And they're kind of, you can put it, their authentic selves, though Rousseau wouldn't have used that language. So they have this kind of dynamism, energy, strength, and joy. And what Rousseau says is that we shouldn't educate them, right, in the way that they've been doing up to that point, by putting them in school, by teaching them curriculum, by teaching them skills, by teaching them to function in society. No, instead, people need to, you know, be children especially need to be lovingly cultivated, right? You need to find the things that a child is good at, their pre-existing qualities, and basically you use education to fertilize that, right? To like they're a flower, right? Find their best qualities and you sort of lean into those, fertilize them, and this child will naturally grow into a mathematician, and that child will naturally grow into an artist, with as little kind of direction and forcing them in particular directions, as you can, right? Because you don't want to squash that kind of unfettered energy that comes with being a young person. And for Rousseau and the Romantics in general, a lot of the problems that come from civilized society, as they think of it, right, using those terms, are that we've squashed people into these little bubbles. Now, we see a lot of this still, kind of in, and you can look at it, in a book like Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. At some point, not this semester, but at some point in the future, I'm going to sort of adapt a portion of it into this course. It's a really interesting book. Um, but you see a lot of the modern self as being, about expressing, some kind of internal essence that you have that you're supposed to cultivate, right? You're supposed to find what your kid, when you're a parent, you're supposed to find what your kid is good at, some natural inclination they have, and sort of, lean into that, fertilize that, make them grow in that particular respect. So if they're really good at music, you help them become like the best violinist that they can be. If they're really good at sports, you drive them all over Hell's Half Acre to go to hockey games and hockey practices at 6 in the morning. And so, I don't know if it was my 12-year-old, he seems to really like playing video games. So I guess I just leave him there to do that, 24 hours a day. That sounds like a pretty bad recipe. Or, I mean, it depends what you're going for. If you're going for incel, probably not a bad recipe. But if you're going for functional member of society, maybe not the greatest. Um, so I'll tell you more about him as we go. He's a sweet kid, like a super sweet kid, but really loves video games just a little too much. Okay, so that is Rousseau, right? And it comes again with some good intentions, I think, but a lot of problems in that, it tends to under-direct young people. Okay, I will say about Rousseau, I just want to give you some background on Jean-Jacques. Rousseau is I was going to say a bad word. perhaps not the best person. Um, amongst his other charming qualities is Rousseau. Well, he seemed to have this, real propensity for writing about children, and philosophizing about them. He doesn't actually seem to have liked children that much. He fathered, probably about a dozen children with multiple different women, all of whom he then abandoned, right? So he doesn't seem to have been like, he's like, children, they're wonderful energy. Ugh, get it away. So I wouldn't say Rousseau um is the greatest model. And some of this seems to have been kind of theoretical, and it may be an apocryphal story, right? So it might not be true, but supposedly, um, a woman approached Rousseau at one point, kind of later in his life, and she had been reading Emile. And she said, Monsieur Rousseau, I've been, I've read your book and I find it so moving, and I've been applying, your philosophies to the raising of my own children. To which, and this is why it's probably not true, but it's a fun story anyway. He promptly replied, "Are you crazy?" So we always want to take someone like Rousseau with a bit of a grain of salt. Maybe didn't like kids that much, and certainly didn't take care of his own, and may have been aware that these are great philosophical ideas, but maybe not a great child rearing philosophy. Okay. Oh, you know. Sorry. As a sociologist, I have a fraught relationship with Freud at the best of times. You know, I thought someone was gonna walk out on my Freud commentary, but no. I have a fraught relationship with Sigmund. Um, However, what you cannot deny, if you are looking at a kind of history of almost anything, right, um, is that Sigmund Freud and his kind of corpus of thought, despite the fact that it was all made up, it has all been like widely discredited, and frankly, it belongs on the trash heap of history. Nevertheless, it has been massively influential. Um, so what does he say about children? Okay, so he has a bunch of different ideas about kids, right? And again, oh, I mean, you should hear me when you take Source of Religion with me. You should hear the diatribe I go on about Freud's views on religion, because his views of religion are even stupider than his other views. And like, you read it and you're like, where did you get any of this? And there's no sense he got it anywhere. He's just like, I think this is how religion emerged. There was this guy, he was a king, and he had, all the women, and he fathered 70 sons with them. But then they wanted some of the women too, so they killed him. But then they felt bad about it, so they invented religion so they could feel better. And you're like, where the hell does that come from? And he's like, that's kind of what I think religion comes from. So, Freud, anyway, I'm sorry. Ideas that he has, right? So, that children in and of themselves have a sort of sexuality, right? That they have sexuality, it's emergent, it's developing, but it's there, right? And there's an awareness of it. They have instincts, and they have these kind of psychic drives, right? And if you know Freud, right, you know that this is expressed in his made up terms: the ego, the id, and the superego, all of which are dumb, but whatever. People believed it, and then, kind of started to think about people using these categories, and these categories are still around. And what he says, right, and this is largely in a book called Civilization and Its Discontents. So you can see there's a link to Rousseau there, that part of the process of moving into adulthood, right, is the sublimation of those base desires, right? So that how to put this kindly, um, you want to control everything, you want to have everything, and as you enter adolescence, you want to have sex with everything, right? Um, it's these kind of impulses that have to be supplemented in for you to fit into civilized society. And for Freud, this is where all of our problems come from, right? All of our neuroses as adults, All of our problems come from, things that we wanted to do as children, that were repressed, right? Our parents, you know, taught us other ways, right? So you wanted to go to the bathroom just anywhere, um, but your parents are like, no, you must use the toilet, right? And so you sublimate your desire to poop in the corner, to go poop in the special room where pooping happens, and that in itself causes sort of problems, right? Oh man, Freud is so weird. Explaining Freud, it's like, are you anal retentive or anal expulsive? And I'm like, oh come on, dude. It's like, I'm so I don't know. One day I'm gonna take this slide out. Okay. So to become an adult, right, you have to sublimate your base desires. But again, because those are kind of inherent to human nature for Freud, it causes a lot of problems, right? And the neuroses that you end up with in adult life are all a reflection of this. We won't even talk about how he thought, all boys want to marry their mothers and all girls want to marry their fathers and all that weird crap that we're stuck with. Okay. Oh, Freud. All right. Now, John Dewey. Here's someone we can all get behind. So, Dewey's still pretty prominent in like a lot of pedagogical theory in, say, education, right? A lot of his ideas kind of still hold sway, and he's still, I think, there's a lot of philosophy built on top of him, but he's still somewhat critical. And his contributions to kind of notions of childhood are things like the idea that, it's great to be John Locke and be like, what kind, and to a lesser extent, Rousseau and someone like Freud, and to think, what kind of adult are we going to end up with at the end of the day, based on how we train children. But Dewey's like, actually, the other thing we need to think about is what do children need right now, right? What are their social and emotional needs right in this very moment, rather than always looking at kind of children as the means to an end, and that end is a functional adult. But how do we, instead of thinking, how do we get this child to be that functional adult? It's like, okay, what does that child actually need now, right? So you can't always think about the future of children. Sometimes you need to address the problems that they are facing, and things you can solve in the present, right? Rather than these kind of abstract parenting and teaching philosophies. Again, you see this a lot, right, in movements in education, like, thinking about social emotional learning, right? How do you attune education to the social and emotional needs of students? And we've seen a lot of changes in pedagogical techniques over the years based on this kind of thinking. Okay, I don't know. Oh my gosh. Okay, there's Freud comments. This can't be good. So you're basically just brainwashing them from a young age. I mean, that is a lot of the thinking about education, right? And about young people, and to an extent, that's true. So is it true that traditional classroom design was made to shape factory line workers? Do I consider it effective contemporarily? Okay, so this is a claim. I will say this is a claim that's often made. You most often see this made by Marxist scholars, right? That basically the education as it was set up in the 19th century was about a couple of things, right? So one of them is basic skills that you're going to need in the factory, right? Reading, writing, and some basic arithmetic, and compliance, right? So you have to listen to a teacher, you have to defer to authority, because you're going to have to defer to authority on the factory floor. Now, I think this is, in a sense, both true and false, right? And I know that's not a super helpful answer. Um, I don't know, like, and when you look back at some of the historical literature, a lot of the people who are trying to design how you educate children are simply like really, really interested in, okay, how do I communicate this information? How do I get them to listen to me? How do I get them to learn the skills? And these are the skills I'm being told they need to know. And how do we manage that? You're also talking about relatively complex, educational situations sometimes, right? If you're off in a rural community, you're in a one-room schoolhouse and you've got 6-year-olds all the way up to maybe 18-year-olds, right? All trying to learn. So how do you teach them, right? You're gonna have to be like, you shut up while I teach these people the things they have to know, right? So there's gonna be a lot of differentiation. That said, I don't know that I've ever seen like direct evidence that people were like, We must form the children to be able to assemble Ford Pintos on the assembly line. These are the skills we need. They need to shut up, listen to us, read and write, and not much else, right? I think it's a lot more complex than that. And it's much more iterative. And there's just a big history in education of trying different things out and seeing what's effective, right? And sometimes it's just like heuristics. It's like, okay, we know this works, so we're going to continue to do it because we don't know anything else that works, right? We don't know a better way of teaching kids how to, have the basic skills to function in an industrial or post-industrial civilization, then put them in a classroom, have them listen to a teacher, learn the basic skills. So some of it is not like, I want you to work in a factory. I genuinely don't. Factories seem really gross. Some of it is like, this is what seems to work, and we're going to continue to do that until we discover something that works better. By the way, Zoom school, not better. I'm sure you all know that, having lived through Zoom school. But I swear, in the 1990s, when the internet was new, people were like, we're going to be able to have one teacher for like tens of thousands of students. It's going to be so cheap. They'll just sit at home at their computer and watch videos on the screen. Yeah, people have funny ideas, right? We don't know a better way to do it. So, we kind of stay with what we got. When doing research, we better look at how someone lived their life or only focus on their work. Yes. Yes. Both of those things. Um, I think it's interesting and important to understand, like, that some of these people had these great ideas, but even they couldn't live them out. I think that's useful information, right? Like Marx viciously beat his maid, and I don't know why that's important to me, but it kind of is, right? And he was kind of I think he raped her too. And he was just kind of an awful person, right? Like, or even I'm thinking of Engels. I can't remember which one it is. I mean, I know that other Marxists like Althusser, he murdered his wife, and claimed insanity and got away with it. That's a subject for a different day. I think both of those can be important. The fact that Marx, well, he talks about the working class, in a lot of ways didn't seem to like the working class very much. There's all that fun stuff. Yeah, Freud. I guess nobody else knew anything about the human mind. Okay, so I want to finish up this unit, and this only took me 30 minutes. Finally, what's my criticism of Marx that has them walking out? Um, okay, so sorry, people leave for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes people just randomly leave in the middle of a lecture, or they got into this class today and they're like, "Oh, screw this guy," and they leave. So I'm not everyone's cup of tea. So, we talk about Postman's kind of account, and his account of where youth comes from really sort of ends, around the beginning to end of the 19th century. Well, I'll give you kind of a really quick kind of speed up through the kind of World War period, and then we're going to start with the silence when we start talking about different generations. But what happens, after kind of like in the 19th century is we get, again, people really, really thinking about young people in very, very concerted ways, right? So people discover adolescence, and this will never cease to amaze me that this is a category that suddenly people are like, wow, people between like 13 and like 18, there's something really weird going on with them. They're so different. Let us name this period adolescence or the coming into adulthood, right? And the people kind of start talking about this. I mean, really, really late, right? Really, really late. When you think about this, this is like 125, 150 years ago, right? It's really, really late. Um, like it happened like yesterday in historical terms, right? And yet to us, it's such a natural category, right? So sometime in here, you start to get psychologists like a guy named G. Stanley Hall, talking about adolescence. And this is a unique period that needs unique skills. And you get, from this discovery of adolescence, and that there's things like an emerging sexuality during adolescence, um, you know, different kind of approaches. Things like middle class boys, especially in Victorian England, they start to be subjected to really, really strict discipline, especially around things like sexuality. So, a lot of them are sent off to boarding school, right? Why? Because in boarding school, there's going to be no girls. And so there's not going to be any little temptations, right, to take your precious middle class boys off the primrose path and tempt them with, girls. So you send your boys off to boarding school. Um, so you get ideas about puberty to understand, juvenile sexuality as something that's emerging, and you're like, oh, well, we want to put a stop to that. So you send your boys off to boarding school, and largely you keep your girls at home, if you're middle or upper class, and have them taught by a governess, right? So that you're not allowing the two to mix. Now, obviously, this is like hugely comic scenarios. What ends up happening in a lot of male-only boarding schools is the boys have sex with each other, because human beings will have sex with almost anything, and if no one of the opposite sex is there, well, people, I guess, figure something else out. So there's a lot of homosexuality that happens in boarding schools, much to the horror of the poor Victorians. All right. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to crime later in the term. Ooh, I should have made this text way bigger. I wonder if I could fix that really quickly. Where is this lecture? That is really small. I'm gonna do some emergency surgery on this slide. Stretch the box. All right, that's ever so slightly better. And yes, I'm sorry, there's a Taylor Swift reference in the title. So at certain points in my life, I get bored and I start playing with slide titles just to amuse myself. Okay, so in the 19th century, in our kind of working class and lower class parts of kind of Anglo-American society in Canada, in the US, and in the UK, you get, this very distinct split. You have your, upper class, which are mostly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and then working class, which are a mix of other ethnicities, depending on where you are, that staff, the factories and all of that. So you have some kind of problems here. For one thing, the living conditions are not particularly good, right? People are relatively poor. Someone working in a factory does not have enough money to support, a family. People have moved into these industrial cities, and they are living in kinds of, these kinds of slums, with all sorts of problems in those slums. And so what do you get? Well, you get a lot of crime. The other problem, of course, is there's no birth control. And so people still have children, relatively large numbers. And those children, because there's not a public education system either, don't really have anything to do. So both parents are working, right? Dad is working probably in the factory. Mom is working at home. While she's caring for children, she's probably sewing clothing or taking in washing or something like that, right? We'll talk about washing later because the washing machine is a big revolution in terms of women's rights. Um, so they're doing all sorts of things, and the kids have nothing to do. So they go out in the streets and they get into trouble, and they join gangs, and they commit crimes, at first petty and then increasingly organized. So in the U.S., right? Right. By the way, that's Leonardo DiCaprio, because it's a picture from the Scorsese film Gangs of New York. Um, you have ethnic elements to this, right? A lot of the criminals are Irish and Italian, right? Recent immigrants that are relatively poor. And they have, relatively poor prospects, um, which leads to disenfranchisement and crime. And they're just bored. They don't have that much to do, right? There's not enough work for all of even the children that want to work. You have like these student movements, bohemianism amongst the middle and upper classes, where people, want to explore things and take drugs, and that always seems to happen. But there's a reaction to it. We'll talk about this more when we talk about crime. These white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and the child saving movement are like, we need to set these poor kids on the right path. And so they start to create institutions. They create courts and public schools and, reformatory institutions all in kind of weird orders and at weird times. It's not sequential or linear, but eventually, by the time you enter the 20th century, you have an intense focus on the lives of young people and families and tremendous state intervention in those things as well, right? The government is very concerned with intervening with them or intervening in the lives of children to keep them on the right path, largely led by kind of do-gooders. Okay, we'll come back to that when we talk about crime. All right, discard my. I'm going to switch slideshows here. I apologize. I usually like to not do this in the middle of a lecture, but I have 12 minutes. Oh. So now we're going to talk about generations a little bit. I'm going to just double check that that something is working as it should. That is not working. Oh dear. Oh me, oh my. Oh, perfect. Fixed. All right. So same Slido. I'm going to try to keep the Slido the same for the whole course. So if you have questions, they should appear from one to the other. Okay. So we're going to shift off and we're going to talk about generations. We're going to fast forward, right? We're kind of at the beginning of the 20th century, the first decades of the 20th century. And we're going to fast forward a little bit through the Second World War, the First World War, the Second World War, the 20s, the 30s, and then into really kind of the 1930s and into the 40s. So that period during the wars or during the Second World War and into that post-war period. So we're going to take I'm taking all of this from a book called Generations. And this is, by who's now a very, very famous scholar named Jean Twenge, who's written a whole bunch of different books on different generations, right? She wrote, starting about her PhD dissertation was on Gen X, the generation she's part of. She wrote two very rude books about millennials that I'm still a little offended about. What was it? Generation Me was the second one, and the first one was the narcissism epidemic, basically accusing millennials of being, huge narcissists. So again, I'll forgive her for that because her work's really good. She's a generational researcher, and her more recent works have focused on Gen Z, who she tried to call iGen, but it didn't really take off. We'll talk about lots of that as we go forward. Okay, so she argues for, and a lot of the rest of the course, we're going to be talking about it in these terms, because I think she's essentially right. What she calls a generational, the technology model of generations. And the basic contention here is that each generational cohort is defined by the technologies that were, or the technological conditions they experienced in their formative years, right? So your teens and 20s, right? So we're going to talk about our silent generation. We're going to talk about baby boomers. They all would have experienced, say, the internet and social media, but they're not going to have been affected by it in the same way as, say, millennials and Gen Z, who came of age during the period these technologies were emerging, or for Gen Z, right, where they were already saturated in the space. Okay, technology for her, right, it affects also every aspect of life, right? Families, education, work, leisure, religion, politics, mental health, values, all sorts of things, right? All of these things are deeply influenced by the technologies that are central when you are young, and new technologies create generation gaps and conflicts, right? Because older generations don't understand them and had different formative experiences in a different kind of technological context. They might not get it and it means something different for them. They can put it into a different context. Okay, now the other thing, because technological progress is accelerating, generational cohorts are getting shorter, right? So whereas, our years for the silence are relatively long, as are the baby boomers, once we get to millennials and Gen Zs, those cohorts are significantly shorter. We used to kind of mean a generation was about 21 years. But now, right, you'll see that Gen Z is really quite short, right? Only about 15 years at the outside. Okay. So life history theory. This is another idea that she presents. And one of the things she suggests is that basically there's two ways that human beings can sort of be, right? Two ways that they can choose to um, like move into adulthood in a large sense, and how they have children, how they raise those children. So you can have what's called a fast life strategy, and basically this is true where you have high in or child and especially maternal mortality, right? So what you do if you live in a situation where you have high child and high maternal mortality, the thing that you do, and parental mortality in general, the thing that you will do is have as many children as you can as quickly as possible, and basically try to raise them really quickly, so that they can stand on their own 2 feet in the event that one or both of their parents die, right? So more children earlier means they'll be more likely to be self-sufficient if one or both parents die. And this would have been, basically the life strategy for most of human history, right? Where, again, not to quote Shakespeare, but, talking about the very young Juliet in Romeo and Juliet, who's maybe 13, right? The nurse remarks that younger girls than her are happy mothers made, right? So it wouldn't have been uncommon for, girls to be getting married, and starting families, 15 years old, probably not often too much younger than that, but that wouldn't have been particularly unusual. So my maternal grandmother, so my mom's mom, got married when she was 17 to my grandfather, right? And that would have been, quite normal in the early 20th century. It happened, right? It's probably on the younger side, but we'll talk about that in a sec. Okay. And you want to see the change in infant mortality, in terms of years. In 1800, right? So at the opening of the 19th century, 1 in 6 children died before their 5th birthday, right? By 2020, it's less than 1 in 200, right? So that is a huge kind of decline in infant and child mortality. All right. So what's more common today is what's called the slow life strategy, right? And this has been sort of building for a few generations. And I think we can argue that, maybe the baby boomers and Gen X had relatively slow life strategies, but the subsequent generations, millennials, Gen Z, and now probably, Gen Alpha or whatever you want to call them, um, are having even slower life rollouts. And we will look at that. So basically, you have fewer children, expect them to grow up more slowly, and you invest a crap ton. Sorry, that's not an academic term. A lot of resources in them, right? You are going to have few children, probably one or two as the norm, and you're going to invest in those children, right? You are going to put a lot of resources into things like interest, education, raising them, getting them to adulthood in a relatively happy state. And why? Okay, so this typically happens when there's less adult and infant mortality. So there's not a lot of need to get a lot of children because a lot of them are going to die, and get them raised really quickly to be self-sufficient because, the odds that you're going to die are relatively low, right? Life expectancy in Canada is what, like 76 years old, I think, on average. So, you're probably, if you have children in your 20s or 30s, you probably got a good 50, 60 years to raise them, before you kick the bucket. So, not a big concern. Education takes longer, right? And typically, they're faced with more economic risk because you're competing for relatively scarce economic resources in in industrial and post-industrial societies, right? Not everybody's going to do well. And, if you live in somewhere like Canada, not everybody's going to, get to do little things like own a house, or those things. So they're at more risk of falling behind economically. And so the impetus is to invest a lot in them. At the extreme end, you'll get places like South Korea, right? Where a lot of people choose not to have children, but those that do will have like one, because getting that child, to adulthood and into like a good university and a good job is extremely difficult and extremely expensive, right? So you have way fewer children and you just, as a parent, investing a ton in them, right? So extensive nurturing ends up being, oops, I'm looking at the time, scribbling on my own slides. Okay. And yeah, there's lots of competition for scarce resources. There's economic inequality, typically fewer jobs available. We'll talk about that when we talk about work. And so you need more parental resources to get them to adulthood successfully, which means you can't have as many children because parental resources are limited as well. All right, I guess we got 2 minutes left, so let's just leave it here. We'll talk about the silence on Friday, and we'll try to tear through these generations as quickly as possible. How's it going?